Frank Miller was 79 years old, the kind of man you could pass a dozen times on the same street without ever really noticing. Every evening, just as the neon lights of Willow Street Diner flickered to life, he made his quiet walk down the block, cane tapping a slow rhythm on the pavement. His coat, a heavy brown one with frayed cuffs, hung loose on his thin frame, and his faded navy ball cap sat low over his pale white hair. Frank always chose the same corner booth by the window, where he could sip a steaming cup of black coffee and watch headlights drift past like moving stars. To the regulars, he was part of the scenery, steady, predictable, and silent, but if anyone bothered to look closer, they would notice his hands. Scarred and rough, his fingers curled slightly as though forever remembering the heat of a fire that once threatened to swallow him whole. Decades ago, aboard the USS Franklin, Frank had rushed headfirst into flames when an explosion tore through the deck, dragging his shipmates one by one out of the smoke. 12 men lived because he refused to leave until the last sailor was safe. That was a lifetime ago, and Frank never spoke of it, not to the waitress who refilled his coffee, not to the neighbor who nodded when they crossed paths, and not even to himself in the quiet of his small one-bedroom apartment. His medals, the few times he let them out of their box, looked dull under the dim light of his kitchen, reminders of a night he could still smell if he closed his eyes too long. At the diner, though, he was just Frank, the old man in the booth with a steady gaze and a taste for plain black coffee, unnoticed by most and underestimated by nearly everyone. Dylan Parker had only been working at Willow Street Diner for 3 weeks, but he already carried himself like he owned the place. Barely 20, with restless energy and a grin that too often leaned toward smug, he moved between tables balancing plates and coffee pots, cracking jokes that sometimes landed, sometimes didn't. When he noticed Frank's scarred hands trembling slightly as the old man lifted his mug, Dylan slowed his step, smirk tugging at his mouth. "What happened there, old man?" "Lose a fight with your lawn mower?" he asked just loud enough for a couple of teenagers at the corner booth to hear. They snickered, their laughter awkward but eager to join in. Frank didn't look up. He simply steadied his cup against the table, his pale blue eyes fixed on the window as though the boy's words hadn't reached him at all. Dylan wasn't finished. As he passed by again, rag in hand, he let his sneaker slide deliberately against Frank's cane, jolting it slightly. "Careful there, Grandpa," he said, feigning innocence but letting the grin linger. The clink of forks and the low hum of conversations in the diner softened for a moment, as though everyone had heard but no one wanted to intervene. A middle-aged man at the counter frowned and shook his head almost imperceptibly, while a young mother whispered to her daughter to keep eating. Frank gripped the edge of the table for balance, steadying himself before easing his hand away and folding his napkin with meticulous care. He didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even glance at Dylan. To him, the small act of smoothing the creases in the napkin seemed more important than rising to a boy's provocation. But to Miguel in the kitchen, watching through the service window, the scene carried a different weight. He had worked there long enough to know that Frank's silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the kind born of someone who had seen worse than a smirking kid with a dish rag. And Miguel's jaw tightened because he also knew, somehow, that tonight wasn't meant to end quietly. From behind the service window, Miguel Santiago wiped his hands on his apron and kept his eyes fixed on the corner booth. He was 45, a man of few words, steady on his feet after 2 decades in the same kitchen. He had seen plenty of customers come and go, but Frank Miller wasn't just another face to him. Over the years, Miguel had picked up bits and pieces of the old man's story from hushed conversations, from the way a few veterans who passed through the diner would nod respectfully at Frank, and from the scars Miguel noticed when Frank paid his bill with those careful, deliberate fingers. He never pressed for details, but he knew enough to understand that Frank's silence carried weight. Tonight, watching Dylan push too far, Miguel felt a flicker of anger settle in his chest. He glanced around the diner. Most of the customers had returned to their meals, pretending not to notice, but the unease lingered in their posture, in the way a teenager stirred her milkshake without drinking it, in the way an older couple exchanged looks but stayed quiet. Frank remained composed, folding his napkin as though the act could hold the room together. Dylan strutted back to the counter, oblivious to the tension he had created, laughing at something a coworker said. Miguel pressed his palms flat against the stainless steel counter, his jaw clenched. He didn't like to get involved in other people's business, but this didn't sit right. Frank wasn't just another customer, and tonight felt different. Something in the air told Miguel the past was closer than anyone realized. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his thumb hesitating over a name saved years ago, a number he had never actually dialed but always kept just in case. He exhaled slowly, eyes drifting back to Frank's lone figure in the booth, and then he pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before a steady voice answered. "Hayes," the man said, brisk and alert despite the late hour. Miguel swallowed, lowering his tone as he turned his back to the kitchen door. "Captain, it's Miguel. He's here again, same booth by the window, Frank Miller." There was a pause on the other end, not hesitation exactly, but the sharp intake of breath from someone who had been waiting years to hear those words. "You're certain?" Hayes asked, his voice tightening. Miguel shifted his weight, glancing through the service window where Frank sat quietly, sipping the last of his coffee, his cane resting against the booth. "I've seen him every night for years, it's him. Tonight feels different, you should come." The line went silent for a moment, and then Hayes's tone shifted, calm but resolute, the sound of a man who had made a decision. "We'll be there." The call ended with a soft click, leaving Miguel standing alone in the hum of the kitchen. He set the phone down slowly, heart thudding harder than he expected. He wasn't the kind of man to meddle, but this felt right, as if the night itself demanded it. Through the glass, Frank adjusted his coat, movements slow but steady, folding a dollar bill with the same precision he always did. To anyone else, he was just an old man finishing his coffee, but Miguel knew better. He wiped his hands on his apron again, forcing his expression neutral as Dylan passed behind him with a tray of empty glasses, laughing at his own joke. Outside, the street was quiet, the diner's neon sign flickering against the pavement, but Miguel felt the weight of change pressing in. Somewhere out there, engines were already starting, and men who understood the truth about Frank Miller were on their way. Inside Willow Street Diner, the night carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. Plates clattered, the coffee machine hissed, and the jukebox in the corner hummed out an old country tune, slightly off-key from years of wear. Families leaned over half-finished pies, teenagers whispered between bites of fries, and Dylan moved quickly from table to table with his usual restless stride, his earlier smirk returning as though the incident with Frank had already slipped from his mind. Frank, however, had stepped outside. The bench beneath the diner's neon glow creaked as he lowered himself onto it, the wood worn smooth from years of weather. He leaned his cane across his knees and pulled his coat tighter against the chill, watching the quiet street beyond. Headlights drifted past like slow-moving fireflies, and the distant rumble of a semi echoed faintly down the highway. For a long while he sat still, his gaze steady but softened by memory, as if waiting for something or someone long gone. Inside, Miguel busied himself with orders, though his eyes flicked often to the window, catching sight of Frank's silhouette against the glow. Every so often, Miguel's hand brushed his pocket where the phone had been, a silent reminder of the call he'd made. He felt the tension in his chest, not of regret but of anticipation, as though the walls of the diner themselves knew the night was about to shift. Dylan, unaware, joked with a pair of college kids at the counter, balancing their plates with exaggerated flair. The laughter covered the unease that still lingered from earlier, though not completely. People noticed Frank outside, sitting alone, and the quiet dignity of his posture seemed to hang in the air heavier than the neon hum. The town was calm, the diner alive, but beneath it all, change was already on the road, drawing closer with every mile. The low hum came first, faint but steady, like distant thunder rolling across the night. At first, no one inside noticed, too busy with pie plates and refilled coffee, but Frank's head lifted on the bench outside, his pale eyes narrowing toward the dark stretch of road. Then headlights cut through the street, sharp beams gliding over the cracked asphalt as three black SUVs rolled into view, engines smooth and deliberate. The diner's chatter faltered. Forks hovered midair, a jukebox tune stuttered to silence when someone pulled the plug. All eyes shifted toward the wide front windows as the vehicles eased into the lot and came to a synchronized stop. Doors opened at once, their hinges snapping crisp against the quiet, and four men stepped out. Their shoes struck the pavement in practiced rhythm, dress blues immaculate, medals glinting under the flicker of the neon sign. The air in the diner tightened. Dylan, halfway through pouring a cup of coffee, froze with the pot midair, his grin collapsing into a blank stare. The teenagers at the booth fell silent, their laughter choking into nervous glances. Even the cook's ladle stopped mid-stir as Miguel pressed closer to the service window, eyes locked on the figures outside. The officers moved with calm precision, shoulders squared, every step measured as they approached the door. When the bell above it jingled sharply, the sound rang louder than it had any right to. The diner, moments earlier alive with weekend noise, now sat frozen in collective breath, as if the whole town had stumbled into a secret it was never meant to forget. Commander Robert Hayes led the group inside, his gaze sweeping the room, steady and searching, until it landed squarely on Dylan at the counter. His voice was calm but carried the weight of command. "Where is Mr. Frank Miller?" For a long second, no one spoke, the silence inside the diner stretching until Dylan's throat worked nervously. He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped outside, sir." On the bench, Hayes gave the faintest nod, not a word wasted, before turning sharply toward the door. The other officers followed in step, their polished shoes clicking against the tile until the bell above the entrance chimed again and the night air swallowed them. Every head inside swiveled to the windows. Frank sat as he always did, shoulders slightly bent, cane balanced across his knees, eyes lost in the quiet rhythm of passing headlights. He didn't notice the four men until their shadows stretched across the pavement in front of him. The sound of synchronized footsteps drew closer, deliberate and steady, and then the officers stood before him in a perfect line. Frank blinked, confusion flickering across his face as he started to rise, but Hayes lifted a hand in a sharp motion. In flawless unison, all four officers snapped into a salute, hands raised to their brows, shoulders straight as stone. Frank froze, his breath catching, his scarred fingers trembling on the bench. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, his eyes shone with tears. Hayes lowered his salute, stepping forward. "Mr. Miller," he said evenly, his voice carrying warmth beneath its command, "I am Captain Robert Hayes. My father served on the USS Franklin. He always said a man named Frank Miller dragged him out of the fire that night, and I want you to know you saved his life." Frank's mouth quivered, the years falling from his face in a single whisper. "Charlie Hayes," Hayes's features softened, a small nod confirming. "Yes, sir, he never forgot, and neither have we." From inside the diner, the crowd pressed to the glass, breath fogging the windows, watching as Frank Miller sat bathed in the pale neon glow, his long-buried sacrifice finally brought back into the light. Inside the diner, no one moved, all eyes glued to the scene outside as the officers stood with Frank. Dylan lingered by the counter, his arms limp at his sides, the coffee pot still in his hand forgotten. His chest tightened as the weight of what he had done crashed over him. The man he had mocked, the grandpa he had shoved with a careless foot, was the very same man being saluted by Navy officers in full dress blues. His smirk, his armor in every interaction, was gone. Shame rose hot in his throat, and before he could stop himself, his legs carried him forward. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed through, sneakers scraping clumsily on the pavement. He jogged a few steps, his voice cracking. "Mr. Miller, sir?" Frank turned his head slowly, eyes still wet, his face lined with age but calm. Dylan stopped short, breathless, his words tumbling out uneven. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "I shouldn't have," his voice faltered, breaking into silence. Frank studied the young man, his pale blue eyes gentle, not sharp, not angry. Slowly, he lifted one scarred hand and placed it on Dylan's shoulder, the touch light but steady. "It's all right, son," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years and the mercy of someone who had seen far worse. "Learn from it." Dylan swallowed hard, his chest heaving as his eyes burned. He nodded quickly, unable to speak, the simple words striking deeper than any lecture. Behind him, Miguel stepped out of the doorway, arms crossed but his expression softened. He clapped Dylan once on the back, murmuring just loud enough for him to hear, "Time to grow up." Dylan nodded again, this time more firmly, his gaze fixed on Frank, who had already turned back to Hayes and the other officers. For the first time that night, the boy understood that respect wasn't demanded with jokes or bravado. It was earned, and it was owed long before he had given it. Back inside Willow Street Diner, the mood had shifted into something almost reverent. Customers who only an hour earlier had been chatting over pie and laughing at Dylan's clumsy antics now sat hushed, eyes drawn toward the window where Frank and the officers stood. The owner, Mr. Jenkins, a stout man with silver hair and a voice rough from years of working the grill, cleared his throat and reached for the microphone that carried into the kitchen. "Frank Miller's table is on the house tonight," he announced, his words steady but edged with emotion. A murmur rippled through the room, then a single pair of hands began to clap, slow but firm. It spread quickly, rolling across booths and counters until the entire diner was on its feet, applause rising like a wave. Some customers whistled softly, others simply pressed their hands together, but every sound carried respect. Frank, coaxed back inside by Hayes and the others, paused at the doorway, his face lined with disbelief. He pressed one hand to his chest, shaking his head gently as if the moment were too much, then allowed the officers to guide him to a booth cleared just for them at the center of the diner. For the first time in years, he didn't sit alone in the corner. Coffee cups refilled, plates of food were set down, and the conversation around the table grew warm with stories, some from Frank, told in his quiet way, others from the officers who had heard them passed down from fathers and mentors. The applause faded into a hum of reverence, but its echo lingered, woven into the air. Dylan stood behind the counter, his usual restless shifting gone, his arms folded as he watched the old sailor laugh softly with his brothers in arms. In that moment, everyone in the diner understood they were witnessing more than a meal. They were part of a long overdue recognition, one that turned an overlooked old man into the honored guest he had always deserved to be. As the night stretched on, Willow Street Diner slowly settled back into its rhythm, but the air never returned to what it had been. Conversations resumed in softer tones, laughter carried with more care, and glances toward Frank were no longer dismissive but filled with quiet admiration. At the center booth, Frank leaned back, a faint smile touching his lips as he listened to Hayes recount stories he had only ever heard from other sailors, men who had lived because he refused to leave them behind. His scarred hands rested on the table, no longer something to hide but a mark of pride, and each time the coffee pot came by, Dylan hurried to refill it himself, placing the cup down gently as if it were something sacred. Near the window, a little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, is he a hero?" The father nodded, his gaze never leaving Frank. "Yes, son, the quiet kind." The boy sat straighter after that, eyes wide as though seeing the old man in a new light, as though learning in real time what dignity looked like. Frank caught the exchange and gave a small nod, his smile deepening, the kind of smile that spoke of gratitude without needing words. When the officers finally stood to leave, the diner rose with them, not in formality but in respect, a wave of applause rising once more before fading into a stillness that felt almost sacred. Frank remained seated, his cane across his lap, watching them disappear into the night, the velvet metal box still resting in his hand. He didn't need speeches or banners. The knowledge that he had not been forgotten was enough. And for everyone who witnessed it, the lesson lingered long after the neon sign flickered out. True heroes rarely ask for recognition, but when the world finally pauses to see them, it changes everyone who does.